Sarah Chen never believed in second chances until the day she met James Washington on Flight 2317 to Atlanta. The encounter would change both their lives forever, though neither could have known it that morning at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Growing up in San Francisco's wealthy Pacific Heights neighborhood, Sarah had learned early that the world was divided into winners and losers. Her mother, a prominent surgeon, had drilled into her the importance of status and success. When her father died of a heart attack at his investment firm when Sarah was 12, her mother had barely shed a tear, telling Sarah that emotional displays were for weak people. By 34, Sarah had become exactly what her mother wanted: successful, wealthy, and completely alone. That morning at O'Hare, Sarah stood at gate B12, her Louboutin heels clicking impatiently against the floor as she checked her phone. Her presentation to the board was in less than 24 hours, and the flight was already delayed. Around her, families hugged goodbye, children whined about their tablets dying, and business travelers typed furiously on laptops. Sarah ignored them all, a skill she'd perfected over years of climbing the corporate ladder. Final boarding call for first-class passengers on Flight 2317 to Atlanta, the gate agent announced, her voice crackling over the ancient speaker system. Sarah gathered her designer carry-on and strode toward the gate, her perfectly styled hair swishing behind her. When James Washington approached his assigned seat next to her in first class, Sarah's carefully maintained facade cracked just slightly. The Army sergeant's uniform was pristine, his posture straight as an arrow, but Sarah's lip curled almost imperceptibly. She'd paid $4,000 for her ticket, and here was someone who probably got an upgrade just for wearing a uniform. "Good morning, ma'am," James said quietly, settling into his seat. His voice was deep but gentle, with a slight southern accent that spoke of somewhere far from Chicago's steel and glass canyons. Sarah gave him the barest of nods before turning pointedly toward the window. She didn't see the flash of hurt in his eyes, or if she did, she chose to ignore it. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin offering drinks, one stopped to thank James for his service. "It's our honor to have you aboard, Sergeant Washington," she said warmly. "Please let me know if you need anything at all during the flight." Sarah's fingers tightened around her phone until her knuckles turned white. She'd worked 14-hour days for years to afford first class, sacrificing weekends, relationships, and any semblance of a normal life. And here was someone getting special treatment just for wearing green. The plane took off, climbing through thick clouds into a brilliant blue sky. Sarah pulled out her laptop, determined to ignore her seatmate, but as she tried to focus on spreadsheets and profit margins, she kept noticing James in her peripheral vision. His hands, large and calloused, fidgeted with something in his pocket. Finally, he pulled out a worn photograph. Despite herself, Sarah glanced over. A little girl with bright eyes and cornrow braids smiled back from the picture, holding a worn teddy bear. The photo was creased and soft at the edges, like it had been handled thousands of times. "Your daughter?" Sarah asked, her voice cool as winter frost. "Yes," James replied softly. "My Maya. She's 8. He touched the photo gently, like it might crumble under his fingers. "This was taken at her last birthday party, before—" Something in his tone made Sarah pause, but she pushed ahead anyway. "Must be nice getting all these perks just for wearing a uniform. Free upgrades, special treatment." The words came out sharp and bitter, like shards of broken glass. James turned to her slowly, his face a careful mask that couldn't quite hide the pain in his eyes. "Ma'am, I paid full price for this seat. I'm not looking for handouts." He paused, then added quietly, "I'm trying to get home to my daughter. She's sick." Sarah felt the first prick of shame, but she buried it deep, the way she'd buried her grief when her father died, the way she buried everything that threatened to make her feel. "Well, good luck with that," she muttered, putting in her earbuds and turning up her music until it drowned out her conscience. The next morning, Sarah was in her hotel room, preparing for her presentation. Her phone buzzed with a news notification she usually would have ignored. Local girl fighting for life, community rallies around Army sergeant's daughter. The photograph made her stomach lurch. Maya Washington, age 8, lay in a hospital bed, tubes snaking from her tiny body. Her cornrow braids were gone, replaced by a pale blue hospital cap. The teddy bear from the photo was clutched in one thin arm, looking even more worn than before. The article explained that Maya needed an experimental heart surgery not fully covered by military insurance. She had a rare congenital defect that had suddenly worsened. James Washington had started a modest fundraiser, trying to save his only child's life. He'd been deployed in South Korea when Maya collapsed at school and had used every penny he had to get back to her as quickly as possible. Sarah remembered her cruel words on the plane, how she'd sneered at a father rushing to his dying daughter's bedside. She thought of her own father, of the last time she saw him alive, how he'd kissed her forehead and promised to come to her piano recital that weekend. He never made it. Her hands shaking, she opened the fundraiser page. The goal was $200,000. They had raised barely a quarter of that. Without hesitation, she donated $50,000. Then she did something even harder. She went to the hospital. Children's Healthcare of Atlanta was a maze of primary colors and cartoon animals painted on walls, trying desperately to make a place of suffering feel less frightening. Sarah followed the signs to the cardiac intensive care unit, her heels clicking on linoleum floors that had seen too many tears to count. Maya's room was filled with beeping machines and the harsh smell of disinfectant. James stood by her bed, holding her small hand, looking more exhausted than any soldier should ever be. When he saw Sarah in the doorway, his eyes widened in surprise. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face for the first time since her father's funeral. "I'm so sorry." Maya stirred on the bed, her eyes fluttering open. They were the same bright brown as in the photograph, but now they were glazed with pain and medication. "Daddy, who's that?" "I'm Sarah," she said, stepping closer. Her legs felt like they might give out. I met your dad on the plane." Maya smiled weakly. "Did you fly first class too? Daddy saved forever so he could get there faster when the hospital called." She paused to catch her breath. He said every minute counted." Sarah's heart shattered. James had scraped together everything he had just to reach his daughter a few hours sooner, and she'd treated him like he was beneath her. She thought of all the times she'd spent thousands on designer bags and shoes, on status symbols that suddenly seemed meaningless. "Yeah," she managed through her tears. "Yeah, I did fly first class. Your dad is an amazing father." Over the next weeks, Sarah became a fixture at the hospital. She brought Maya books and stuffed animals, read her stories, and held her hand through painful procedures. She used her corporate connections to help navigate insurance nightmares and medical bureaucracy. When Maya was too tired to eat, Sarah would coax her with stories about her own childhood, about the father she'd lost, and how he used to make her laugh. James watched it all with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. One night, as Maya slept, he found Sarah in the hospital cafeteria, staring into a cold cup of coffee. "Why are you doing all this?" he asked softly, sitting across from her. Sarah looked up, her eyes red from lack of sleep. "Because 22 years ago, my father died of a heart attack. I was 12. Nobody could save him." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, seeking warmth that wasn't there. "But maybe I can help save Maya." When Maya's heart stopped during surgery, Sarah held James as he sobbed, praying to a God she'd stopped believing in years ago. For 6 terrifying hours, they waited while surgeons fought to save her life. Sarah thought about all the walls she'd built around her heart, how they'd crumbled the moment she saw Maya in that hospital bed. When the surgeon finally emerged, exhausted but smiling, Sarah and James clung to each other, crying tears of relief. Maya had pulled through. Against all odds, that tiny warrior of a girl had fought her way back to them. Recovery was slow and painful. Sarah took a leave of absence from work, something she'd never done in her entire career. She learned to change IV lines, to recognize when Maya was in pain but trying to be brave, to make her laugh even on the worst days. She watched James with his daughter, how gentle this strong soldier could be, how he never gave up hope even when things seemed darkest. 2 months later, Maya was strong enough to go home. As Sarah helped pack up the hospital room that had become their second home, Maya tugged on her sleeve. "Are you going to disappear now that I'm better?" the little girl asked, her eyes wide with worry. "Because I don't want you to. You're family now." Sarah knelt down, pulling Maya into a gentle hug. "Never," she whispered fiercely. "You and your dad are stuck with me forever. Family doesn't abandon family." James watched from the doorway, tears in his eyes. "You know," he said softly, "sometimes the worst moments in our lives lead us to the best people." Sarah looked at this little family, a soldier who'd never given up, a child who'd fought death and won, and herself, a woman who'd learned that true strength had nothing to do with power or money or status. She thought about how close she'd come to missing this, how her prejudice had almost cost her the chance to know what real love felt like. That night, after helping James and Maya settle into their home, Sarah drove back to her empty penthouse apartment. She looked around at all the expensive furniture, the art on the walls, the closet full of designer clothes. None of it meant anything anymore. She sat down at her desk and wrote 2 letters, one to resign from her corporate job, and one to start a foundation dedicated to helping families facing medical crises. Years later, Maya would ask about that first meeting on the plane. Sarah would tell her the truth, how sometimes people can be cruel and judgmental, but how love and forgiveness can transform even the hardest hearts. How a chance encounter at 30,000 feet had saved not just Maya's life, but Sarah's soul. Today, Sarah Chen runs one of the largest charitable foundations supporting children with critical illnesses. Her office walls are covered in artwork from her hospital kids, as she calls them. But her favorite piece is still the first one, a crayon drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands, labeled Daddy, Maya, and My Sarah. It hangs right above her desk, reminding her every day that second chances aren't just possible. Sometimes they're the most important moments of our lives. The Foundation's headquarters is in Atlanta, just 10 minutes from the house she shares with James and Maya. They married 2 years after Maya's surgery, in a small ceremony in the hospital chapel where they'd spent so many anxious hours. Maya, healthy and strong, was their flower girl. Every year on the anniversary of that flight from Chicago to Atlanta, the family has a special dinner. They read Maya's old hospital diary, look at photographs, and remember the journey that brought them together. Maya, now a pre-med student determined to become a pediatric cardiac surgeon, always makes them tell the story of how they met. "Tell me about the plane again," she'll say, even though she knows every word by heart. And Sarah will look at her daughter, because that's what Maya is now, in every way that matters, and remember that angry, prejudiced woman on Flight 2317. She'll remember how close she came to missing out on this life, this love, this family, and she'll be grateful, once again, for second chances. Because sometimes, she's learned, love doesn't arrive in grand gestures or fairy tale moments. Sometimes it arrives in a cramped airplane seat, wearing army fatigues, carrying a worn photograph of a little girl who needed a miracle. Sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as our worst moments, teaching us that it's never too late to open our hearts and let love change us forever. And every night, before bed, Sarah looks at that crayon drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands, and she thanks whatever twist of fate put her on Flight 2317, proving that even in our darkest moments, love can light the way home.